delays that patients normally would experience as they're waiting for an appointment in primary care and, frankly, in specialty care. But our focus, obviously, is going to be on primary care. There's a significant challenge to this work. I'm sure most of you have either dealt with patient concerns or struggled internally to improve access, so it's not a new subject, but it certainly is one that's plagued us for a long time. We know that it's quite a journey, and in fact, as organizations move from whatever their current state is, could be weeks or days or weeks or months of delay for patients to get in to see their primary care provider. Getting to the gold standard of actually being able to offer care today with the PCP of record is quite a journey. It takes generally about 10 to 12 months, and the reality is we have 9 weeks of pretty intensive study of access improvement. The good news is you'll be receiving all kinds of information, whether you're going to currently actively engage in moving towards a new access aim, or you're here simply to absorb the information so that when you're ready to move forward with this work, you have it at hand. Either way is fine. Our goal is that you get the information that you need, and that for those of you who are anxious to move forward, we're able to support those efforts as well. And so to that end, what you may have noticed is that we have modules basically for each of the 3 months that we're going to be having our weekly calls. And obviously this is the first of those calls, and we're going to be concentrating clearly on the pre-work portion. One of the things that I want to stress is that this work or these calls really build one upon the other. So it's very important. Sometimes people think, oh, well, that's really interesting. Maybe we'll, I won't go to the call next week. I'll have someone else join in. And what we found is that having others join the call is certainly fine, but you really want to have your core folks sitting in and listening because, as I said, the material builds from 1 week to the next. This is a very brief outline of what we'll be covering in the next 9 weeks or so. And clearly here we are, January 17th, doing our pre-work review, and we'll be talking about baseline measures. Now, our objectives for today's call are to review key points in the pre-work packet. And please know that I totally appreciate the fact that you've been inundated with reams of paper and lots of information. So the pre-work packet itself is pretty large, and in addition to that, of course, you received a number of information sheets that we use to support this work. But what we'd like to do today is we'll start by harvesting any questions or concerns that you have, whether it's from the articles, whether it's from discussions, and most importantly, whether it's from the pre-work packet. I will tell you, frankly, that the pre-work packet measurements generally generate quite a bit of discussion and lots of questions. So hopefully folks have had an opportunity to at least glance at that, and we'll be able to address your questions. We also want to make sure that that you leave this call with a sense of how to create an access aim. Again, very important. We'll never reach our aim if we don't know precisely where we're going. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And also, we'll talk a little bit more about the information series support material. Let me just tell you that those sheets are things that are topic related. So, for example, the information sheets that you should have received include how to measure an appointment delay, appointment demand and supply in an advanced access practice, understanding panels, understanding continuity, and measuring the no-show rate. So we're going to touch on all of those topics briefly on this call, but please know that that information series is available for you as backup as you're trying to talk to other colleagues about what this work looks like and what's it about. So they're pretty detailed references that expand and support the conversations that we have on the WebEx. Okay, So just a quick review. I'm sure many of you were at the launch meeting this summer, and we had an opportunity to talk about this business of dramatically improving access. And the model that is kind of our point of reference is what we refer to as advanced access. And because it's been around for about 15 years now, we developed this in primary care, and it's since spread to specialty care, but the roots clearly are in primary care. And there have been, you know, hybrids and modifications to the model. But what I attempted to do in this slide is to really talk about some of the things that people sometimes get confused about when we talk about advanced access. And so here they are briefly, and we're actually going to drill much deeper into this on our next call. But advanced access is basically no delays for an appointment. It's continuity for patients and their primary care providers. So we develop a system that consistently matches patients with their PCP when they're coming in for an appointment with a primary care provider. I know many of you have done a tremendous work on empanelment, and that really is setting the stage for you to optimize continuity for patients and providers. And it's about doing today's work today, understanding what constitutes today's work, how much can we forecast and anticipate in terms of demand for today, and how is it that we're going to actually accomplish today's work so it doesn't spill into the future. What advanced access is not, and these are some misconceptions that have cropped up, I think, over the years, it's not about holding appointments in anticipation of same-day urgent demand. We have all done that, you know, whether we're holding appointments in an urgent care center or a walk-in clinic, or we're holding appointments on an individual provider schedule. It's something we've all done, but it's a model, unfortunately, that tends to degrade over time. And again, we'll talk more about that further down the line as we delve into this a little bit more. So it's not about a walk-in clinic or an urgent care clinic, although, again, that's something we've probably all done in order to attempt to meet today's demand. And it's not about telling patients, please call back when we release the appointments. We see that commonly plays out, but if we stop at that point, we really aren't, we're not able to, nor are our patients able to enjoy a truly advanced access system. So if you're doing any of these things currently, don't worry about it. You're in great company. You're just at a certain point in the journey, and our goal is to help move beyond that point to a true advanced access model. We really want to start with an aim, and this is the gold standard for access. It's the ability of a practice, an individual provider, to offer an appointment today for any problem, whether it's urgent or routine, with the primary care provider or teammate in the absence of the PCP. So obviously the key components here are the ability of the practice to offer that appointment. Patients may not opt to take advantage of that appointment today for a variety of reasons, but we want to be positioned to offer that. We also know that this distinction between urgent and routine changes throughout the day, changes depending on how busy the schedule is, changes depending on how anxious the patient is. That urgent routine distinction is something that we're, you know, as healthcare workers, we totally understand, but it's our definition, and very often it simply doesn't match up with what's urgent or routine in the eyes of patients. So, the advanced access model is really based on, let's defer to the patient's definition of urgent and routine, because if we're positioned to offer that appointment today regardless, then frankly, it just doesn't get any better than that, and we don't have to worry about patients falling through the cracks, which is obviously a big concern. And then there's this piece about having patients see their PCP when they're in the office, or a teammate when the PCP is gone. And this is where your empanelment work comes in really, really handy. If you don't understand which patients are aligned with which providers, it's very difficult to reliably match patients with their PCP. And one of the things that happens is we end up with more referrals, more hospitalizations, longer lengths of stay, more prescriptions are ordered when our system isn't able to reliably match patients with the PCP. Satisfaction goes down, lots of not so great things happen. So again, I just want to applaud you for the work that you've done on empanelment, because that's such a foundational building block. And once those patients are fairly and equitably distributed among the primary care providers, then we have a fighting chance of matching patients with their PCP rather than having them float to someone else. So let's just move into it. I am anxious to hear from folks who have had an opportunity to look at the pre-work or take a look at some of the information sheets, or just are coming to this call with some questions. What I'd like to do is harvest some questions that you have, and then begin to drill down in terms of pre-work measurements, because the purpose, of course, of those measurements is to establish a baseline so that you have a sense as you move through this work, are the changes that you're testing and is the work that you're doing actually resulting in an improvement? And so, Jarrett, how would you recommend, should we have people raise their hands or chat in the question? What do you think would be the best approach here?
Either of those are we could use either of them. If you would like to chat or your question into the chat box, that's fine. I'll read it aloud for everyone to hear. And alternatively, you may click on the raise hand icon, and I'll unmute your phone line, and you can ask the question before the group. We are getting a question in right now, and the question is measuring time for the third. Why do you use calendar days instead of business days?
Oh, that's a great question. So thank you to whoever posed that question. We look at calendar days because we want as much as possible to do our measurements from the patient's perspective. And frankly, weekends and holidays are real days in the lives of a patient. So recognizing that we're not, most of us, open 24/7, clearly, from a business perspective, that's looking at business days is certainly one way to do it. But the standard has really become, let's look at the calendar days. What's the actual delay that patients experience when they're calling in for an appointment with their primary care provider? And I have had some groups that have looked at business days and decided they'd like to continue to do that, because that's sort of the, again, that's the perspective from within the practice. And they've also added to that looking at calendar days. We really want to understand what is it that our patients experience, and hence we're looking at calendar days. So thanks for that question. It's a really good one. Other questions or comments that folks have or experience that they have with this, with that particular issue of measuring third next available? Again, don't be shy about raising your hand or chatting in. I suspect if you've got a question, there are probably lots of others who do as well. Oh, I actually see a question down here, Jarrett, from Connie Bishop.
All right. Yep, I see it too. And Connie, I'm going to unmute your phone line. Let's see if I can find it. And you know what? I'm going to unmute everyone's phone line for a moment. Please, if you're not Connie, please mute your phone line from your end, and that way we'll get her question in. And Connie, your line should be open. Please ask your question to Ms. Tantau.
Okay. I'm from Piedmont Health Services in North Carolina. And one of our questions is, did you count open access appointments that are no-show in your overall no-show rate?
So that's interesting. So it sounds to me as if you're carving out or holding some slots that you call open access slots. You're holding those each day in anticipation of urgent demand. Is that, am I getting that right?
Yes, ma'am. Some people call it advanced access, but yes.
Okay, and so your question is, if you have those slots and they don't get filled, is that considered part of your no-show rate? That's interesting. No-show rates are generally a function of those patients who were scheduled, what percentage failed to show. So if you didn't fill one of these slots, if it never got filled, then clearly it wouldn't be part of your no-show rate. But if you had a patient that actually went into one of those appointment slots that failed to show, then they would be factored into your no-show rate. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am. And let me see if I can restate it. We keep certain advanced access or open access appointments open. If they are not filled, clearly they would not go into that failure rate. However, if I do fill it and then I don't come, that would count in my no-show rate.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good question. It sounds like you've done some work in this area. Nice.
The folks at Piedmont have. I just have been there 6 months, so I'm collecting their questions.
Good for you. Thank you. So let's see if we've got any more questions. Otherwise, we'll move on to drilling down to some of these measurements. I'd like to give folks.
We are getting another question in from the chat function. This question is about measuring the daily demand, and it seems to be the daily demand seems to be very labor intensive. How do practices do this on a daily basis since it involves so many entry points? RN, multiple front desk staff.
Boy, somebody's done their reading. Yeah, daily demand appointment demand is, I would have to say, the most challenging of the measurements that you'll do. When we developed this model, 15 years ago, it was a low-tech approach, and the only thing we could do was measure by having anybody who booked an appointment actually do a tick mark for each provider they booked an appointment for. So clear, and if you've got multiple folks in your system booking appointments, then it means lots of people tick marks and somebody collecting them and then tabulating the total demand for each. Now with electronic medical records and obviously with the ability to track appointments, not the day they land on, and we'll talk about that momentarily, but the actual booking of the appointment on any given day, sitting down with someone who supports your IT functions, what you can actually begin to do now is run a report that will tell you on Monday Dr. Jones had 20 appointments booked. Whether they were booked for today or a week from today or a month from today doesn't really matter, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But you can actually pull an appointment, pull a report that will tell you and get out of the business of tick marks, because it's a lot to manage. But having said that, we certainly have had teams do it both ways and quite successfully. But it's a huge relief when you can move to an electronic system. And it looks like somebody actually made a comment about, how are people getting the continuity? So I'm looking at another question here, Jarrett. How are people getting the continuity measure out of their EMR systems, specifically centricity? So it's another question from Connie. So let me just comment on that, and then I think we'll move forward with the working through some of the issues in the actual measures in the pre-work packet. There's so many EMR systems out there. I can't speak to centricity specifically, so please, if someone else has been pulling the continuity measure from centricity, please feel free to chat that in and share that with the rest of the group. But generally, this is how it works. So if your patients are impaneled, right, to a specific PCP, and that's a matter of record in the EMR, and you know which patients came in last month, right, and who they saw, then you can pull a report. And again, this is something you really would love, ideally have your IT person sitting with you and explain. What I want to understand is, of our patients who came in last month, what percentage, for a primary care visit, what percentage saw their PCP? And if you're filled in the field for the PCP and you know who the patient actually saw when they came in last month, that report will be able to give you the continuity rating for each of the PCPs. It's not a reflection of the, sometimes what we'll hear is, well, a provider might say, well, every patient I see every day is my patient. I have 100% continuity, which is one way of looking at it. But again, it doesn't tell us of that provider's panel how many of those patients drifted to other PCPs for whatever reason. The provider was gone on vacation, whatever the situation might be. So we want to look at it from the patient's perspective. On any particular panel, what percentage of patients on that panel who were seen last month actually saw the PCP? So I'm hoping that will help. And again, I encourage other folks, if they're working with centricity, to please feel free to chat in their experience as well.
Great.
So, Jarrett, shall we move on to the actual pre-work measurements?
Sure. There's one more question. It's a follow-up to the daily demand question.
Okay.
Ali Patel writes, I would assume tick marks need to be used for deflected appointments, i.e. patients who cannot be seen.
Yeah, oh, this is great. You guys are you've done your work. So when a patient has not been seen, let's say you're out of appointments, or they say, well, I'll call back, or we tell them call back tomorrow, we're going to be releasing more appointments, do we count that as part of today's demand or not? And it's a tricky one, because what we know is that in many of our systems, patients call in 3, 4, 5, 6 times before they actually land an appointment, right? Talk to your receptionist. They'll be able to give you some sense of, how often that happens, that they're not able to satisfy the patient's request. Or we might say go to our urgent care clinic or our walk-in clinic today. Whether they actually go or not, again, unless we're appointing them, we don't actually know. So when we look at tabulating demand for appointments, what we look at for those patients who were not able to offer an appointment to for a variety of reasons, or they decline, what we recommend is that you actually put that number in of deflected patients unable to book for whatever reason in a separate column, so that we understand the magnitude of the problem. In other words, how often do our patients are we not able to satisfy their need? We don't include it in the overall appointment demand number, because again, if patients are calling in several times and all they really want is one appointment, there's a tendency to inflate because of their multiple tries to inflate the actual demand number. At some point, that patient's going to get an appointment, and that's what they want, is an appointment. So again, when we look at that process for tabulating appointment demand, we know that it often passes through many hands. It's often many messages. It can be multiple phone calls. So because of that prolonged process with so many steps and so many handoffs, we have to pick a moment of truth. And the moment of truth where we actually put the tick mark down is when the appointment is actually booked. So what we're counting, frankly, are appointment booking transactions on any given day. Okay? So I know that's it's a little complicated, but I think we should probably drill into that at this point and talk about that in a little more detail.
Great, thank you, Ms. Tantow. And Connie, do you have another question? Okay, maybe not. We are getting one more chat question in. Martha Hammond writes, when calculating panel size, is there a standard for how far back all sites are going?
Let me just answer that briefly, and again, I encourage other people to chat in their experience. I happen to be a proponent of, we can dig into the archives and get a lot of history, but what's really nice is to think in terms of what's currently happening at your centers. Who are patients currently aligned with? Typically, what we look at is an 18-month, and some people do it for 12 months, some do it for 24, but we typically look at 18 months of activity. So when you release that panel information, you've got a sense of what patients actually were aligned with what providers during that 18-month time frame. Next month, you release the report again, and the oldest month drops off and the newest month comes on. So you've got this fairly current, for the previous 18 months, glimpse at who's currently empaneled to which providers, recognizing that some of those patients have left for a variety of reasons, but it gives you, the window tends to be about 18 months. Okay, great. So I think what I'd like to do now, and hopefully most of you have a copy of the Access Pre-Work Packet in front of you, that certainly would help. And I'm going to, I'm not going to go through a lot of the preparation checklist. That's something you can certainly read on your own, and there's a lot of general information. The access vision and so on. Those are all things you can read on your own, but I want to drill down to a pretty practical level and start looking at on page 7 where we start to talk about the measurement pre-work. So if you've got that in front of you, just go ahead and turn to page 7 and we're going to walk through it. The first, actually, I think we may have had some confusion on the page numbers here. The first assignment that hopefully you've had a chance to think about, and if not, it's a great thing to work on this week, is this establishing an access goal or an access aim. And I've shared with you the gold standard, which is that 100% of patients requesting an appointment will be offered an appointment today for any problem with their PCP or teammate in the absence of the PCP. And you'll see that listed about mid-page on page 7. Again, just thinking in terms of an assignment for the next week or two, this is something you're going to want to think about and talk about, and perhaps draft that aim statement and certainly bring it to our next call. So let's move forward to the next page on page 8 where we start talking about what to measure. And let's drill down to about halfway down page 8 where it says what to measure. And the first measurement, key measurement, is appointment delay, the third next available. And I think Connie asked a question about that. And I think most of you are probably familiar with it. So I'm going to go over that briefly. The third next available is really the anchor measure for access. It's what tells us, for any provider, how long is it that patients generally wait for a routine appointment? Because we know we've got mechanisms to get patients in if they're urgently ill. We bring them into the urgent care clinic or the walk-in clinic, or we double book or we overbook. We generally do lots of triage if we're in a delayed system. We have to. We don't want anybody to fall through the cracks. So the measurement for access isn't what's the delay for an urgent problem. It's what's the measurement for a routine problem. The kinds of things that we wouldn't necessarily jump through hoops for. What's the delay that patients experience? And we look at calendar days to the third next available routine appointment. Sometimes people will say, well, we're going to look for physicals. That's the appointment type we're going to look for because it's rarely urgent. And that really is up to you. What's the kind of thing that you probably have a long delay for, but there's no sense of, in general, no sense of urgency about it? We recommend measuring that first thing Monday morning before the phones open, measuring that third next available for each provider so that each PCP has and their care team really understands what's the delay that my patients are experiencing. Because as they begin to work on reducing that delay, they're going to want to see that number come down. So a simple run chart where you track that measurement over time becomes a really important tool. And again, I can't stress how important it is to actually do this for each PCP. This is improving access is not something that we can do without the involvement of the providers and their care teams. And it requires some significant work on their part. So they need and want that an accurate measurement of what's real for them and for the patients that they serve. So if you look on page 9, in the middle of the page, this was a group that we worked with in the Midwest, Plover, and they were measuring in primary care, their long appointments. For some reason, they didn't have much of a delay with short routine appointments, so they wanted to measure their long appointments because that was the toughest one to get. And what you can see on that graph, it's pretty busy, but this was one of their groups, and you can see the delay started anywhere from 15 days up to almost 50 days, depending on the provider, and how they were all very successful in bringing that down significantly. That trend line is certainly interesting, but you can imagine that the individual providers were much more interested in how they were doing. And then you see a lot of them hovering, most of them, towards the end of that graph, hovering around 0 days delay. Now, again, if we look towards the end of the graph, you see a couple of providers who are up around about 14, 15 days. We would expect that. When someone goes on vacation, of course their delay is going to extend. But one of the really interesting things to see, I don't know if you noticed the big spike, the largest spike that's about 3/4 of the way through this graph. It would be lovely if this had been annotated. My guess is that that was a vacation that someone took. They were hovering around 0 days delay. They'd done really nice work. All of a sudden it spikes up to almost 50 days. Maybe it was an extended sick leave, who knows. And then it came down pretty quickly. So in a really healthy advanced access system, when people are gone, the system is designed so that their patients are cared for in the absence of the PCP, and so their recovery back to 0 days delay can be quite rapid. Initially, it's a bit more of a struggle, but that's a really healthy sign that they were able to recover as quickly and as nicely as they did. So I'm just curious to know what kinds of delays people are currently experiencing. And again, if you want to chat that in or raise your hand and share it, or perhaps a better way of asking that would be, how many of you are currently measuring third next available? Just feel free to raise your hand.
And we're getting a chat in from Piedmont Health. They say they are, and Connie confirms that.
Okay, great, fantastic.
And anyone else? Oh, I see a question, raised hand from Sally Patel. And Sally, I am unmuting your phone line, so your phone line is now open.
Hi, Sally.
Oops. And we are experiencing some technical difficulties. Let me unmute everyone's phone line for the moment. Sally, you should be unmuted now.
She's on her cell phone.
Hi, Sally.
While we're waiting for Sally, Andrea Brooks, do you have a question as well?
Sorry, didn't have a question. I was just trying to raise my hand and say yes, at Camilla's, we're tracking it currently.
Okay.
And Andrea, let me ask you, are you measuring calendar days?
Yes.
Oh, terrific. And how do you find that? I mean, is that working for you?
We've got a long wait.
So you're on the right call.
You're an honest woman.
Hold on one second. I'm trying to pull it up. It just ran away from me. Yeah, ours is quite long. Our shortest delay we've been tracking it for about a week and a half.
Okay.
Our shortest delay was 35 days. And our longest delay is over 100. I'll leave it at
So
that.
you've been tracking it for about a week and a half. You know, let me just be clear. This is not a measurement that you need to do every day.
Gotcha.
You only need to do this once a week.
Okay.
And we recommend Monday morning because, before the phones open, before we start booking things, it just seemed, and you could pick a different time. I have one group that's very rigorous about this, and they don't measure it until the middle of the day, which,
Gotcha.
We know that most appointments are already booked, by about 11 o'clock in the morning. So
correct.
Anyway, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that unless you're very, very far along on this journey. But there's, keep it simple. Measure it first thing Monday morning. It's somebody's job to sit down and, plunk through the computer, have a list of providers and say their third next available appointment is whatever it is.
Sure, that works. Thanks.
Dot the dot, yeah, because you're going to be busy with plenty of other measures. So save your energy.
Okay.
Save your energy. But thanks for sharing that. That's really helpful.
Sure. And we are getting a couple more chats in. Martha Hammond writes, third available for 1 month, and Rural Health Center is 10.1 days.
Okay, great. Great.
And we're also getting something from Emma Harrell here at Carborough, Piedmont. Third available is 6 days for some providers.
Okay, so we've got some nice low numbers. We've got some high numbers. And, it's interesting. Some of the best results we've had, interestingly enough, have been from groups that have had, we had one group that had a 300-day delay. It happened to be with the Veterans Administration. And they just felt like it was impossible. Once they measured their demand and supply, they thought, boy, if we could just get rid of that backlog, we actually would be okay. And one of the things they found was that the same patient was on the schedule multiple times. And one of the very first things they did was, and I recommend this to people who have very long delays, is to look at the schedule and see, are there duplicate appointments for patients? Because very often, it doesn't, unless it's a prenatal visit or, something like that, it doesn't make a lot of sense to book multiple appointments. And even, frankly, with prenatals, that's not always the best strategy either. But if you find the same patient populating lots of appointments, you might really want to step back and say, why is that? Why are we doing that? And perhaps even call the patient and say, I see you're coming in next week, and we've got you booked for 2 other appointments after that. Let's see what we can accomplish next week, and then begin to do more with next week's visit so that they don't necessarily have to take up so many slots. So anyway, we'll talk more about those strategies later. It really is a way of saying don't be discouraged if you have a long delay. The strategies work in all scenarios. You just sometimes have to do them a little bit longer than you would with a group that has the 6-day delay. So thanks for sharing that. And for those of you who have not yet measured delay, I encourage you to start doing that as soon as possible. Again, first thing Monday morning, make it somebody's job, create a simple run chart, and begin to post it and to talk about it if you're at that stage in terms of your access journey.
And we do have 2 more chats. Sharita Stewart from LA Christian Health Center writes that they are currently tracking TNAA using calendar days.
Terrific. Fantastic. That's great.
And also Connie wrote in that we've been tracking for several years, third next. Third next is 8 to 10 days, and no-show stable at 14% at the PHS org level.
Okay, great. So that's an interesting comment that Connie made about it's been stable at 8 to 10 days. It's interesting. It's kind of an interesting question to ask yourself. What's your delay, and what was it a year ago, or what was it 2 years ago? And what we find most often is exactly what Connie's sharing here, is that frankly, it doesn't change that much. Now, it might if you have explosive growth in your community, or you have a drop in, a dramatic drop in providers. But that stability is interesting, and often people will say, well, we've had a 3-month delay for as long as I've ever been here. How could we possibly improve it? They see it as kind of a mark of you know, we couldn't possibly get better. The reality is that you likely, what that tells us when there's that stability is that you actually have some equilibrium in terms of the amount of demand that you have and the amount of supply that you have. You're just 3 months too late, or you're, you know, in Connie's case, 8 to 10 days too late, if you will. But again, so it's not a bad sign. It actually is a sign of stability. So that's great. So I think what I'd like to do, oh, here we go, Connie. Connie says last year it was better, stable at 6 days, but we've lost some providers. So the issue here, and I just want to take advantage of this example because it's probably happened to others. What Connie and her group understand very clearly is that it was not necessarily a surge in demand, but when you lose providers and you have fewer providers to take care of the same population, then that equilibrium between appointment demand and appointment supply is thrown off, not because the demand has changed, but because the supply has dropped. So as you go through this work, it's a really useful way to think about it. It's not to say that, you know, this doesn't work or it's a nightmare. Or it's just really analyzing what's out of whack here and what do we need to work on. So that's really it's a really great and astute observation. So if you look at the bottom of page 9 in the pre-work packet, you'll see assignment number 2 is to begin measuring delays for each of your PCPs and start graphing the number of calendar days to third next available appointment. Over time, you'll have a run chart like the example here. And bring that data to these calls, because what we hope as the calls progress is that we're actually able to work with particular issues or problems or examples that you're able to bring to the call. So we really want to help you solve some of the real problems that you're having and not just be functioning on a theoretical plane. So, okay, so let's go to the next page of your pre-work packet. Page 10, which talks about appointment demand, and we've touched on this briefly. And again, not to scare you, but just to be frank about the fact that this is probably the most challenging of the measurements. We really want to be able to forecast and predict demand for each provider by day of the week. We used to think that was impossible. It felt like our systems were in such chaos. How could you possibly predict anything? And yet when you step back, what you realize is, you know, we actually already do some predicting. For example, this is the first day after a 3-day holiday for a lot of you. Anybody in your center can probably tell you that this is going to be a really busy day. The Monday after Thanksgiving, where we very often have 4 days of pent-up demand, tends to be, in some organizations, the busiest day of the year, or the first business day after the Christmas and New Year holidays. So, so we know from experience that some days tend to be busier than others. And we took that experience and said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could actually measure the actual demand in real time for each PCP? And so what we do with this particular measurement is we look at all demand for appointments, whether it's urgent or it's routine, and we start to see some interesting patterns emerge. And the value of predicting that demand is that then we can look at our supply of appointments and say, does Monday's demand for appointments match up with the number of providers that we have on board to meet that demand? So we can do a much better job of matching things. But let me walk through the formula here, because it's very, very important, and it's a little counterintuitive. So the first thing we want to look at are, and again, if you look at the box in the middle of page 10, we want to look at what we call external appointment demand for each provider. And the first thing we look at is the total appointment requests that are called in or referred into your health center today and booked. And the key here is booked, regardless of the day to which the appointment is actually assigned. So if you have 20 appointments, 20 patients calling in, requesting an appointment, and there's actually an appointment booking transaction that occurs, each of those 20 patients would have a tick mark next to the provider that they're appointed to, okay? The next thing we want to look at are the total number of patients that might walk in requesting an appointment today and are actually booked. So again, the booking of the appointment is, that's when the tick mark hits the sheet. Just in the same way, if you're pulling this information electronically, that's what the data is going to tell you. How many appointments were actually booked, whether they called in or they walked in, and that conversation resulted in the booking of an appointment. Those count as today's demand, whether they land on today's schedule or the future. And then finally, for external demand, and we call it external because it comes to us from the world. We don't have control over it. Patients call in, they walk in. It's essentially out of our control. The number of deflections that can be tracked. Now, these would be patients that were sent to urgent care or another venue of care and actually seen by that other service. So let me give you an example. You may have a patient, the receptionist talks to them and says, your doctor's completely overbooked today, but if you want, you can walk into our walk-in clinic. Now, the tendency would be to put that as demand for that provider, but the reality is it didn't result in the booking of an appointment. So we put that in a column off to the side, and when you look at your information sheets, you'll see an example of how you can do that. If your urgent care clinic or your walk-in clinics are part of your center, then what you can do is you'll be able to look at that and say, 10 patients from Dr. Brown actually ended up in the urgent care clinic today. We're going to count that as some of Dr. Brown's demand, because ideally, Dr. Brown would have been able to see that patient. Okay, so but we don't credit that to Dr. Brown or whoever until that patient actually comes in and is seen, whether it's through that booked appointment or they've walked in and we can confirm that they were seen in urgent care. If they go to another venue of care that's not related in any way to your organization, you have no way of knowing that. You simply know that that request is in this separate column where you weren't able to satisfy their demand to see Dr. Brown. So patients calling in today and booked an appointment regardless of the day that appointment falls on, patients walking in requesting an appointment today and booked, and the number of deflections that can be tracked, typically urgent care walk-in clinic, and they're actually seen by that service. So it means working cooperatively with that other service. So that's external demand. Internal demand are those number of patients who were seen today, right? They're on the schedule, could have been there for a few days, could have been on the schedule, could have been booked months ago, it doesn't really matter. But of those patients who came in today, how many of them left today's appointment with the return appointment booked and in hand? It's wonderful if we can understand that, because that's the demand that we generate ourselves. We generate it ourselves, and which means there's some things we can do about that. And we all know that depending on the practice, some folks bring patients back a lot, some folks bring patients back not as much. This is not about judging that, it's simply about understanding it. Collecting that, and that almost always has to be a manual thing, because when we look at an electronic report, and let's say I'm a patient that comes to your center, I was seen today, I leave with a follow-up appointment booked and in hand. When that electronic report is run, it's simply, it's not going to tell you, as you're looking at that report, whether that was external demand or internal demand. And so tracking that and recognizing that those patients who leave today with a return appointment booked and in hand are that portion. So let's say, again, let's use Dr. Brown as an example. Dr. Brown had a demand for, let's say 30 appointments were booked today for Dr. Brown, whether it was for today or the future. And then the person who's booking those follow-up appointments says 10 of those were actually patients that were generated by internal demand. They were seen today and they came to my desk and I booked a follow-up. And that's a way to look at separating external from internal. Now, that may be too complicated for you initially. So I would just say don't get too hung up on it. Recognizing total demand is a very good place to start. So let me stop here and see if there are any questions about this. And again, feel free to raise your hand. I see a few folks have their, Sally Patel has her hand up. I'm not sure, Sally, if that's an old question or if you need us to call on you.
And I'm not seeing any additional questions.
Okay.
Sorry, Sally does have a question. She asks, how do we incorporate new patient demand?
Okay. So new patient demand, it depends what happens. If a new patient calls in or walks in requesting an appointment and they're booked, they would be counted as demand, right? And to keep it simple, you'd probably count them as demand for whoever schedule they landed on. Now, that may or may not end up being their PCP, but we don't want to lose that demand, right? We want to understand it because it's part of your bucket of demand. If a new patient approaches the practice and we aren't able to give them an appointment for whatever reason, we're closed, whatever the reason, we're full, that would be the perfect demand to put in that side column where we say, you know, this happens, maybe this happens rarely, maybe it happens, you know, once a month, maybe it happens every day. So again, in that column, we wouldn't count that because that request doesn't result in the booking of an appointment, but it's on our radar. We recognize to what degree are we failing to meet the demands, if you will, of the patients who are approaching us. So, and so again, this demand number, a lot of people say, well, we should be counting it. Well, the problem is that new patient may approach us several times, and it's very, we can find ourselves in a situation where we're really inflating the demand number. And we don't want to do that. So again, it's on your radar. You see it in that number in the column. We may need to develop some strategies for that. But we want to keep the actual demand calculation very pure. The moment of truth is when that patient has actually booked the appointment, and that demand counts for the day that the booking transaction takes place. Okay. Any other questions or comments that you can see, Jarrett?
I am getting another question in the chat. Javier Hiriart, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, Javier. He asks, in the X part of external demand, does it count whether they are seen that day or not?
No, it doesn't. So let's say I walk in to your center and I want an appointment and you see me today. I'm booked, right? There's a booking transaction. I walk in, I get booked an appointment, I'm seen tick mark. Or I walk in and I don't really need to be seen today. I just happen to be in the neighborhood. Anytime in the next week will do. You book me an appointment for 3 or 4 days from now. It still counts as a tick mark today because we want to keep this measurement as clean as possible. Did I need today, want today? Apparently not, but we're going to count it as today. What we found, and we've tested this a lot, is that when we try and understand how far out, you know, there's so much variation in terms of when patients want to be seen that if we try and factor that in, it becomes an impossible task. And at the same time, what we're finding pretty consistently in primary care is that once patients get used to the offer of an appointment today for any problem, it's about 75 to 80% of the time they're thrilled and delighted, particularly if it's with their PCP. So we want to keep this clean. So if I walk in and you're booking me for the future, we still count it as today's demand, just as we would when the patient calls in. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes.
Terrific, terrific. So we're getting a little short on time, and we have more that we could be covering, but I want to be respectful of your time, and I'm thinking it probably makes sense on next week's call to pick up this conversation with your questions, and also we'll delve into appointment supply, because I really want to make sure that you've got a good grounding in what this is all about. It's just a really important foundation. So that would be my suggestion. And again, review the pre-work if you haven't already. We've talked about setting an aim. We've talked about appointment delay. And we've talked about appointment demand, which is the toughest one. The other issues are going to be fairly, by comparison, a little bit easier, so I'm not too worried about that. At the end of this call, what I'd really like you to do is take a few minutes to jot down the things that you would like to have on your to-do list, thinking in terms of the assignments that we've talked about, and certainly the measurements. And then, so again, next week's call, which is, you might have noticed that we've intermittently put in these coaching question and answer calls to really be able to support your questions. An hour, again, is not a lot of time to get through some of this material. So if folks are amenable to that, we can simply continue the conversation on these baseline measures on next week's call. But before I close, I want to see if there are any lingering questions or comments that we should be sharing with folks. Jared, anything from your perspective? We've got about
I don't see any other questions. Javier, I see your hand is raised, and I've unmuted your, let's see, I've unmuted your phone line. I'm not sure if this was relating to your previous question or not.
Yes, thank you. The question was answered. I raised my hand until I learned that I chatted, so.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
I'm not seeing any other questions, raised hands or chat questions.
Well, let me just say, again, thank all of you. It really is an honor and a privilege to be able to do this work with you. I'm excited about the opportunity to improve access to care for all of your patients, and look forward to our call next week.
Great, and thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you all for participating in today's web conference. I will be posting a link to the recording of today's webinar in the Virtual Learning Lab. And after you leave this webinar, you will see an evaluation of the webinar. Please take a few moments to complete it. Of course, we always use evaluation data to help us make improvements for next time. As Catherine mentioned, the next webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, January 24th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and it will be focused on coaching Q&A. In the meantime, if you have any questions, you can reach Catherine by email at ct@tantauassociates.com. And thanks again, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.